There's a photograph that still sits in the Briar Creek Sheriff's Department, filed away in a metal drawer that hasn't been opened in decades. It shows 3 boys standing in front of a wooden barn, their clothes torn, their faces blank. The image was taken in the summer of 1958, 2 days after they were found. If you look closely at their eyes, you'll see something that doesn't belong in children, something older, something that had seen too much. The boys were discovered on a Tuesday morning by a mail carrier named Eugene Watts, who'd been driving the same rural route for 17 years. He knew every family, every dog, every mailbox along that stretch of pine and red clay. But on that particular morning, he found 3 children walking barefoot down County Road 14, moving in a straight line like soldiers. They didn't speak. They didn't look at him. When Eugene stopped his truck and called out, asking if they were all right, the oldest boy turned his head slowly and said only 4 words. Came from there. He was pointing toward the woods. The authorities were called within the hour. Deputy Frank Hollister arrived first, followed by Sheriff Raymond Cobb. What they found has never been fully disclosed to the public. The official report states that the boys were malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from exposure. It says they were taken to Briar Creek General Hospital and treated for minor injuries. It says they were eventually reunited with their families. But that's not the whole story, not even close. Because when Sheriff Cobb sat down with those boys in the back room of the station, what they told him didn't make sense. Not at first. They spoke in fragments, in half-sentences that circled around something they couldn't name. They talked about a place deep in the woods where the trees grew wrong, where the ground was soft and the air tasted like metal. They talked about a man who wasn't a man, and they talked about the others, the ones who didn't come back. For 3 days, Sheriff Cobb kept those boys in protective custody. He didn't release them to their families. He didn't let the newspapers near them. He barely slept, because what those boys described wasn't just trauma, it was evidence. Evidence of something that had been happening in Briar Creek for a very long time, something that no one wanted to believe. And once he understood what they were really saying, Sheriff Cobb made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The boys had names, but for weeks after they were found, they wouldn't respond to them. The oldest was Daniel Pritchard, age 12. The middle boy was his cousin, Samuel Pritchard, age 10. The youngest was not a Pritchard at all. His name was Thomas Earl, age 8, and he lived 4 miles away from the Pritchard farm in a house his grandfather built during the Depression. No one could explain how these 3 boys, from different parts of the county, ended up together in those woods. No one could explain why they'd been missing for 6 days without a single search party being organized. Because here's what the records don't tell you. No one reported them missing. Daniel's mother, Ruth Pritchard, told investigators she thought her son was staying with his uncle. Samuel's father, Leonard Pritchard, said the boy had permission to camp on their property. And Thomas Earl's parents claimed they believed he was visiting his grandmother in the next county. But when Sheriff Cobb pressed them, when he sat across from these parents in their own kitchens and asked them to look him in the eye, something broke. Ruth Pritchard started crying and couldn't stop. Leonard stared at the floor and said nothing. Thomas Earl's father walked out of the room and didn't come back. They knew, not everything, but enough. Enough to know that when children disappeared in Briar Creek, you didn't ask questions. You didn't call the police. You waited. And if they came back, you thanked God and never spoke of it again. If they didn't, you told yourself they'd run off, that they'd gone to live with relatives, that they'd gotten lost, anything but the truth. Sheriff Cobb began pulling records, missing persons reports going back 20 years. And what he found made his hands shake. 11 children had vanished from Briar Creek and the surrounding area since 1938. 11. Most were boys between the ages of 7 and 13. A few were girls. None of the cases had been seriously investigated. The files were thin, barely a page each. Assumptions had been made. Runaways, drowned in the creek, lost in the woods, but there were patterns Cobb couldn't ignore. They all disappeared in summer. They all lived within a 10-mile radius. And in almost every case, there was a mention of the woods. A friend who said the missing child had talked about going into the woods. A parent who remembered their son or daughter asking about the old logging trails. A teacher who recalled a student drawing pictures of trees. The woods weren't just a location, they were a destination. When Sheriff Cobb finally got the boys to talk, really talk, he set up a tape recorder in his office. This was 1958, reel to reel. The kind that clicked and hummed while it captured every word. That tape still exists, locked in an evidence locker in a facility that no longer appears on any map. Only 3 people have ever been allowed to listen to it in full. What follows is based on the partial transcription that was entered into the case file, the fragments that someone decided the world could know. Daniel Pritchard spoke first. His voice was flat, drained of emotion, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized against his will. He told us we were chosen. Sheriff Cobb asked Daniel who was. The boy didn't answer right away. He looked at Samuel, then at Thomas. The three of them exchanged a glance that Cobb described in his notes as coordinated, almost rehearsed. Finally, Daniel spoke again. The man who lives in the hollow. Briar Creek had several hollows, low, lying areas between hills where water collected and the air stayed cold even in August. But there was one hollow that locals avoided. It didn't have an official name. On maps it was marked as part of the Tillman estate, a tract of land that had been abandoned since the 1920s after the family died out. People called it the Sinking Hollow because the ground there was unstable, soft. There were stories of livestock wandering in and never being found, of hunters who swore their compasses stopped working once they crossed into that area. Children were told to stay away, but no one ever explained why. It was just understood. Daniel said the man had been watching them for weeks before they were taken, not following. Watching from the tree line behind the school, from the edge of the field where they played. He never came closer. He never called out. He just stood there, patient, waiting for them to notice him. And eventually they did. Samuel Pritchard, the middle boy, was the one who saw him first. He described the man as tall, thin, wearing clothes that looked old-fashioned. A dark coat that hung past his knees. A hat with a wide brim that shadowed his face. But it was his hands that Samuel remembered most. Long fingers. Too long. When he gestured for them to come closer, his hands moved like they weren't attached to anything, like they were floating in the air on their own. Thomas Earl, the youngest, said the man smiled at them. But he didn't say it like it was a good thing. He said it the way you'd describe a dog baring its teeth. The boys didn't go to him right away. For 2 weeks they saw him almost every day, always at a distance, always watching. And then one afternoon in late June, Daniel found something in his school bag. A small wooden figure carved to look like a boy. It was crude, rough, but the details were specific. The height was right, the hair was right. It was him. He showed it to Samuel and Thomas. They'd each found one too. That night, Daniel had a dream. In it, the man was standing at the foot of his bed, and he was speaking without moving his mouth. The words came from somewhere else, somewhere deep. He said the boys had been marked. He said they belonged to the hollow now. He said if they didn't come willingly, he would come for them in their sleep, and it would be worse. When Daniel woke up, there were dirt smudges on his bedroom floor, footprints, leading from the window to his bed and back again. 3 days later, the boys met at the edge of the Pritchard farm and walked into the woods together. They didn't tell anyone. They didn't pack food or water. They just went, because part of them already knew they didn't have a choice. They'd been chosen, and in Briar Creek, when you were chosen, you went. The walk took hours, deeper than any of them had ever gone. The trees grew denser, the light dimmer. The air smelled wrong, sweet and rotten at the same time. And then they saw it, a structure half buried in the earth, part cabin, part cellar, part something else. The door was open. Inside they found the others. There were 7 children in that place when Daniel, Samuel, and Thomas arrived. Some were sitting, some were lying on the dirt floor. None of them spoke. Their clothes were filthy, their skin pale, their eyes distant. Daniel recognized 2 of them, a girl named Clara Finch who'd gone missing the summer before, and a boy named James Collier who'd disappeared 3 years earlier. James would have been 14 by then, but he looked younger, smaller, like something had stopped him from growing. The man was there too, standing in the corner, not moving, just watching them adjust to the dark. Sheriff Cobb asked Daniel what the man did to them. The boy's answer was recorded in the transcript, but it's incomplete. Whole sections were redacted. What remains is this: he didn't hurt us the way you think. He didn't hit us, he didn't touch us like that, he just kept us there, and he talked to us. All the time. Even when we were sleeping. His voice was in our heads. The man told them stories about Briar Creek, about the families who'd lived there for generations. He knew things no stranger should know. He knew about Daniel's grandfather, who'd hanged himself in the barn in 1944. He knew about Samuel's mother, who'd lost a baby before Samuel was born and never spoke of it. He knew about Thomas Earl's uncle, who'd drowned a dog in the creek when he was a boy and told everyone it ran away. The man recited these secrets like he'd been there, like he'd watched it all happen. And then he told them why they'd been brought to the hollow. He said the land remembered. That Briar Creek had been built on top of something older, something that had been there long before the town, before the farms, before the families with their churches and their schools and their lies. He said the people who lived there had made a deal generations ago, and they'd been breaking it ever since. The land was owed, and the children were the payment. Samuel Pritchard broke down when he tried to explain this part. He started shaking and Cobb had to stop the tape. When they resumed, Samuel's voice was barely a whisper. He said the man showed them things, visions, memories that weren't theirs. They saw men in old clothes, standing in a circle in the woods, making promises they thought they could walk away from. They saw children being led into the hollow, one by one, over decades. They saw what happened to the ones who fought, the ones who screamed. The man told them they could leave, but only if they understood. Only if they carried the knowledge back with them. Because the families needed to remember. The debt was still due. For 6 days, the boys stayed in that place. They didn't eat. They barely slept. The man didn't chain them. He didn't have to. The hollow kept them. The air was thick, oppressive. Every time one of them tried to move toward the door, their legs stopped working. Their thoughts became sluggish. It felt easier to stay. But on the 6th night, something changed. The man left. He walked out into the woods, and for the first time, the door stayed open and the feeling lifted. Daniel looked at Samuel. Samuel looked at Thomas, and without a word, they ran. They didn't try to wake the others. They didn't help Clara Finch or James Collier. They just ran. Through the trees, through the dark, stumbling and falling, and getting back up until they found the road. That's where Eugene Watts found them the next morning. Sheriff Cobb asked Daniel why they didn't bring the others. The boy didn't cry. He didn't apologize. He just said they'd been there too long. They didn't want to leave anymore. Sheriff Raymond Cobb organized a search party the same day he finished interviewing the boys. 18 men, deputies, volunteers, a few hunters who knew the woods better than anyone. They brought dogs, rifles, rope, and enough supplies to stay out there for days if they had to. Cobb led them himself. He carried a copy of a hand-drawn map that Daniel Pritchard had sketched from memory, marking the path they'd taken into the sinking hollow. They found the area. The trees that grew wrong, twisted and leaning like they were trying to pull away from something beneath the soil. The ground that felt too soft, that seemed to shift under their boots. The air that tasted metallic, that made their throats tighten. But they didn't find the structure. They didn't find the cabin or the cellar or whatever it was the boys had described. They searched for 3 days. They dug. They cut through brush. They walked in grids, covering every inch of that hollow. Nothing. No building. No children. No man in a dark coat. Just trees and mud and silence. On the 3rd night, one of the volunteers, a man named Carter Grimm, told Cobb he wanted to go home. He said he'd been hearing things. Whispers that didn't have a source. Footsteps that stopped whenever he turned around. He said the woods were wrong and they needed to leave. 2 other men agreed. By morning, half the search party had packed up and left without a word. Cobb stayed. He went back into the hollow alone, against the advice of his deputies. He spent hours walking the same paths, looking for anything the boys might have recognized. And that's when he found the photographs. They were nailed to a tree. Old, faded, some of them brittle with age. Photographs of children, dozens of them. Some were formal portraits, the kind families used to take in studios. Others were candid shots. Cobb recognized a few faces: Clara Finch, James Collier, a girl named Beatrice Lowell who'd vanished in 1942, a boy named Peter Ames who disappeared in 1947. All of them were smiling in the photos. All of them looked happy. Cobb tore the photographs down and brought them back to the station. He spread them out on his desk and started matching them to missing persons cases. 11 children, 11 photographs. But there were more pictures than cases. Faces he didn't recognize. Children who'd never been reported missing at all. He went back to the families. This time he didn't ask politely. He demanded answers. And slowly, in fragments and whispers behind closed doors, the truth started to surface. The people of Briar Creek knew. Not everyone, but enough. The older families, the ones who'd been there since the town was founded, they'd grown up with stories. Warnings passed down like folklore. Don't go into the sinking hollow. Don't follow strangers in the woods. Don't ask what happened to the children who disappeared. It was the price. That's what some of them called it. The price for the land, for the crops that grew, for the town that survived when others didn't. And when their own children were taken, they grieved in private. They didn't call the police. They didn't search. Because part of them believed it was supposed to happen. That resisting it would bring something worse. Sheriff Cobb couldn't prove it. He couldn't arrest anyone. There was no conspiracy he could name, no law that had been broken in a way he could prosecute. Just a town that had learned to look away. A town that had traded its children for peace. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? If you'd grown up knowing the truth, would you have stayed silent? Or would you have been the one to finally break the cycle? Sheriff Raymond Cobb filed his report in October of 1958. It was 73 pages long, detailed, methodical. He included witness statements, the boys' testimonies, the photographs he'd found nailed to the tree, and a list of every missing child case in Briar Creek going back to 1938. He documented the search efforts, the inconsistencies in the family's stories, and his own observations about the sinking hollow. He concluded that there was sufficient evidence to warrant a full investigation by the state police, possibly even federal authorities. He requested resources, manpower, and legal support to pursue what he called a pattern of criminal negligence and potential organized concealment of child endangerment. The report was sent to the county prosecutor's office. It was reviewed, and then it was quietly buried. Cobb received a response 3 weeks later, a single-page letter informing him that after careful consideration, the prosecutor had determined there was insufficient evidence to proceed. The missing children cases were too old, too fragmented. The boys' testimonies were considered unreliable due to trauma and possible delusion. The photographs proved nothing except that someone had collected old pictures. And as for the man in the woods, no physical evidence of his existence had been found. The case was closed. Sheriff Cobb didn't accept that. He went over the prosecutor's head. He contacted the state attorney general's office. He reached out to newspapers. He tried to get anyone to pay attention. But every door he knocked on closed in his face. Editors told him the story was too strange, too unverifiable. State officials thanked him for his diligence and suggested he focus on cases he could solve. Even his own deputies started distancing themselves. They stopped talking about the boys. They stopped going into the hollow, and then the pressure began. Cobb started receiving phone calls at home, late at night. No one spoke on the other end, just breathing, waiting. His wife found dead animals on their porch, a crow, a possum, a dog that didn't belong to anyone they knew. His tires were slashed twice in the same week. Someone broke into his office and removed files from his desk. Not all of them, just the ones related to Briar Creek, the ones he'd kept copies of at home. In November, Cobb was called into a meeting with the county commissioners. They told him he was being reassigned. Effective immediately, he would no longer serve as sheriff. They offered him a position as a deputy in a neighboring county, a demotion with a pay cut. When he asked why, they said his conduct had become erratic, that he was pursuing cases with no merit, that he was damaging the reputation of Briar Creek and causing distress to families who'd already suffered enough. He refused the transfer. He resigned instead. Raymond Cobb left Briar Creek in December of 1958 and never returned. He moved 2 states away, worked as a security guard, and lived alone in a small apartment until his death in 1981. He never married. He never spoke publicly about what happened. But in his personal belongings, his sister found a cardboard box filled with documents, copies of everything he'd gathered, the case files, the photographs, the transcripts of the boys' interviews, and a journal handwritten where he'd documented everything the county tried to erase. On the last page of that journal, Cobb wrote a single sentence: "They're still there." The 3 boys who survived were separated after they were released from protective custody. Daniel Pritchard was sent to live with an aunt in Tennessee. Samuel Pritchard stayed in Briar Creek, but was forbidden from speaking about what happened. Thomas Earle's family moved to Georgia within a year. None of them stayed in contact. None of them ever gave another interview. Daniel Pritchard died in 1984 in a car accident. Samuel Pritchard died in 1999 from a heart attack. Thomas Earle is still alive. He's in his 70s now, living under a different name in a town that isn't Briar Creek. A researcher tried to contact him in 2003. He refused to speak, but he did say one thing before he hung up the phone. "I still hear him every night. He's still talking. A Briar Creek still exists. It's smaller now. The population has declined since the 1960s. Young people leave and don't come back. The old families, the ones with names that go back generations, they're still there. But they don't talk about the past. If you ask them about the missing children, about Sheriff Cobb, about the sinking hollow, they'll tell you they don't know what you're talking about. They'll say it's just stories. Old rumors that got out of hand, but the woods are still avoided. In 1973, the county tried to develop part of the Tillman estate. They wanted to build a recreational park, hiking trails, a campground. Crews went in to clear land and survey the area. Within 2 weeks, 3 workers quit. They reported equipment malfunctions, tools that went missing and reappeared in strange places, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. One man said he saw a figure standing at the tree line at dusk. Tall, thin, wearing a long dark coat. When he called out, the figure didn't move. It just stood there watching. The project was abandoned. The land was left alone. In 1985, a group of teenagers from a neighboring town decided to explore the sinking hollow on a dare. 4 of them went in, 3 came back. The 4th, a 16-year-old named Marcus Webb, was found 2 days later, wandering along County Road 14, barefoot, disoriented, unable to explain where he'd been. His friends said he'd just walked away from them, deeper into the trees, like he was following something. When his parents took him to a hospital, doctors found no physical injuries. But Marcus stopped speaking. For 6 months, he didn't say a word. When he finally did, he told his mother he'd seen the others, the children who never left. He said they were still there, underground, waiting. Marcus Webb died by suicide in 1992. He was 23 years old. There have been other incidents, hunters who've gone into that area and come back different, quiet, withdrawn. Families who've noticed their children drawing pictures of trees and dark figures without being able to explain why. A pastor in Briar Creek who in 2001 tried to organize a prayer vigil in the hollow to cleanse the land. He made it halfway in before turning back. He told his congregation he felt a presence there, something that didn't want them, something that had been there longer than any of them and would remain long after they were gone. He left Briar Creek 3 months later and never returned to ministry. The photographs Sheriff Cobb recovered were never released to the public. They remain in an evidence locker, technically part of an open case that no one has worked on in over 60 years. The tape recordings of the boys' interviews were classified and restricted. The transcripts that exist are partial, redacted. But they're out there, in archives, in private collections, in the hands of people who've spent years trying to understand what really happened in Briar Creek. And the question that no one has answered, the question that still hangs over everything, is this: what was the deal? What promise was made and by whom that required the sacrifice of children? Who was the man in the hollow, and why did the land protect him? And if the debt is still owed, if the cycle was never truly broken, then who is paying the price now? Because the children still go missing, not in Briar Creek anymore. The town learned to be quieter about it, but in the surrounding counties, in the rural areas where families don't ask too many questions, where people still believe that some things are better left alone, there are cases, cold cases. Children who vanished without a trace. And if you look at the patterns, if you map the disappearances over decades, they all circle back to the same area, the same woods, the same hollow. The man is still there. The boys said so. Thomas Earl confirmed it, and everyone who's gone into that place and come back has felt it. The presence, the watching, the voice that speaks without sound. Briar Creek wants you to forget. It wants the story buried, the files closed, the witnesses silent. But the land remembers, and the debt is still due. If you've made it this far, you know what most people will never allow themselves to believe, that there are places in this country where the past isn't past, where the ground holds secrets that should never surface, where the price for silence is paid in blood, generation after generation, and no one has the courage to say stop. The Briar Creek Boys were found in 1958. What they told the sheriff broke the case open. But it didn't save anyone. It didn't stop anything. It only revealed the truth that everyone already knew and no one wanted to face. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again.